This video is sponsored by Brilliant. You've probably heard it before, that deep, resonant bong echoing through an old house. That sound comes from a grandfather clock, also known as a long case clock. These elegant timekeepers are powered by the steady pull of falling weights and keep time through the rhythmic swing of a pendulum. Most grandfather clocks also include a chiming mechanism, which you can recognize by the presence of 3 weights instead of 1. Each weight powers a separate function. One weight drives the timekeeping mechanism. Another powers the hourly strike. The third weight powers the quarter-hour chime, most commonly the Westminster chime. In this video, we'll explore how mechanical clocks keep time, how chiming and striking mechanisms are integrated, and how the clever design of the pendulum brings greater accuracy to these timeless machines. The story of mechanical clocks begins in the 13th century with the invention of the verge escapement, the first known mechanism to regulate the release of energy in a clock. These early timekeepers used a foliot, a horizontal bar with weights, to oscillate back and forth. While revolutionary, they were not very accurate, often drifting by hours over the course of a day. In the late 16th century, Galileo Galilei observed the isochronism of pendulum swings, discovering that pendulums take the same amount of time to complete each swing regardless of amplitude, but there must be a small swing angle, like 4 to 6 degrees. This insight paved the way for a major leap in timekeeping. In 1670, clockmaker William Clement developed the anchor escapement, which worked far more efficiently with a swinging pendulum than the older verge design. According to the harmonic formula of a pendulum, the time it takes to swing, its period, depends only on its length, assuming a constant gravitational field. That means a shorter pendulum swings faster, while a longer one swings more slowly. To make the pendulum complete one swing per second, the required length is about 99.4 centimeters. This is one of the main reasons grandfather clocks have such tall cases, to house the long pendulum needed for precise timekeeping. Now, let's take a closer look at the internal mechanism, known as the clock movement. It's relatively small compared to the large wooden case and is typically made of brass. The movement is powered by falling weights, which are suspended by chains that loop over sprocket wheels. As a weight descends under gravity, it pulls the chain, which rotates the sprocket wheel and in turn drives the main gear wheel, powering either the timekeeping, striking, or chiming mechanism. When the weights reach the bottom, the clock must be rewound, usually by pulling the opposite side of the chain to raise the weights back to the top. This can be easily done by opening the glass door on the front of the case. Some grandfather clocks use a different winding system. Instead of chains and sprockets, they rely on cords and pulleys. In these models, the weights are raised by inserting a winding key into the keyholes on the clock dial and turning it manually. Grandfather clocks typically come in 2 duration types: the 8-day clock, which is more expensive and often features a more decorative design, and the 30-hour clock, which is simpler and more affordable. A typical chiming grandfather clock runs for about 8 days on a full winding, meaning it takes 8 days for the weights to descend from the top to the bottom. This long drop is another reason for the clock's tall case. It must provide enough space for the weights to travel fully. As a bonus, the tall design also places the dial conveniently at eye level. Inside the movement, there are 3 separate gear trains: the time train, which controls timekeeping, the strike train, which drives hourly strikes, and the chime train, plays the quarter-hour chimes. Let's begin with the time train, which is connected to the pendulum and powered by the center weight. The weight turns the sprocket wheel, which connects to a ratchet wheel. The great wheel, the first large gear in the time train, is not connected directly to the sprocket. Instead, it's driven through a spring-loaded pawl mechanism. When you raise the weight, the pawl skips over the ratchet wheel so the great wheel doesn't rotate backward. But when the weight descends, the pawl locks onto the ratchet teeth and turns the great wheel forward. This design allows the weight to be reset without reversing the gear train. From the great wheel, motion is transferred to the second wheel, then to the center wheel, followed by the third wheel, and finally to the escape wheel. This interaction is called the anchor escapement. It is made up of two main parts, the escape wheel, which has saw-like teeth, and the anchor, which hangs above it. As the anchor swings back and forth, its two curved surfaces, called pallets, alternately engage with the teeth of the escape wheel. Without this mechanism, the gear train would spin freely until the weight reached the bottom. Instead, the pallets control the motion by allowing the escape wheel to advance half a tooth with each swing of the anchor. When one tooth is released by a pallet, the next is immediately caught by the other pallet. During this brief contact, the pallet receives a small impulse from the tooth, which helps maintain the pendulum's swing by replacing the energy lost to friction. In a typical setup, the pendulum takes 1 second to complete a swing, causing the 30-tooth escape wheel to advance half a tooth per second, completing one full rotation every minute. Now let's talk gear ratios. To make the center wheel rotate once per hour, which drives the minute hand, we need a total gear ratio of 1 to 60 from the escape wheel to the center wheel. If you're unsure about how gear ratios work, I explained this in detail in my previous video on mechanical alarm clocks. The gear ratio from the escape wheel to the third wheel is 7 to 56, and from the third wheel to the center wheel is 8 to 60. Then the product 1 to 60 is the gear ratio from escape wheel to center wheel. This ensures that the minute hand rotates once per hour. To keep the clock running for 8 days, the center wheel must complete 192 revolutions. This motion is reduced through the gear train, first by the second wheel with a gear ratio of 10 to 67, and then by the great wheel with a ratio of 20 to 60. As a result, the great wheel only needs to rotate about 9.5 times over the 8-day period. Given that the effective diameter of the sprocket wheel is approximately 3.5 centimeters, this requires a weight drop of around 1.05 meters. Due to the high overall gear reduction, about 1 to 603 from the escape wheel back to the great wheel, the great wheel must deliver significant torque to drive the entire mechanism. This is why the weights need to be heavy, in order to overcome the friction and transmission losses throughout the gear train. The pendulum itself includes several key parts. At the top is the suspension spring, a thin, flexible strip that acts as a nearly frictionless pivot point. Connected to it is the pendulum leader, which transfers motion through a crutch to the escapement anchor. The long pendulum rod extends downward and is joined with a weighted disc called the pendulum bob. At the base of the bob is an adjustment nut. Turning this nut raises or lowers the bob, changing the effective length of the pendulum. This allows fine-tuning of the swing period. As mentioned earlier, the pendulum in grandfather clock typically swings once per second, which means the escapement ticks once per second as well. The minute arbor is directly connected to the center wheel and drives an intermediary gear with a gear ratio of 1 to 2. The hour arbor, which is loosely mounted on the same shaft, is driven by this intermediary gear through a 1 to 6 gear ratio. Combined, this results in an overall 1 to 12 gear reduction from the minute arbor to the hour arbor, meaning the hour hand rotates 30 degrees for every full 360-degree rotation of the minute hand. Now let's take a look at the strike train, the mechanism responsible for striking the rods to count the hours. Unlike the chime train, where each hammer can move independently, the strike train has all its hammers joined together. The strike train begins with a great wheel turned by its own weight. Connected to it is the second wheel, which drives a ratchet wheel. This ratchet wheel interacts with a hammer lever, causing it to lift and strike once per tooth as it rotates. The ratchet wheel then drives the pallet wheel with a gear ratio of 10 to 1. This means that for every full rotation of the pallet wheel, the ratchet wheel, which has 10 teeth, advances 1 tooth, producing 1 strike. The pallet wheel turns the warning wheel, which powers a vane-type flywheel, often called an air governor or air brake. This spinning vane resists motion through air drag and slows the striking sequence, ensuring that the chimes don't happen too fast and allowing for a more even, measured pace. If left unregulated, the strike train would run continuously, striking the chime rods repeatedly until the weight reached the bottom. To prevent this, a long lever, known as the strike flirt, is used to control when the strike train is released. This lever includes a small pin that rides along the edge of a rotating disc called chime locking disc, which is attached to the chime train. As long as the pin rests on the raised edge of the disc, The lever remains engaged with a stop pin on the warning wheel, keeping the strike train locked. When the pin drops into a groove, the lever moves out of the way, releasing the warning wheel and allowing the strike train to activate. We'll explore how the chime and strike trains coordinate with each other in the next section. The primary role of the strike train is to chime the correct number of times to mark each hour. To accomplish this, the mechanism relies on 4 key components: the gathering pallet, the rack, the snail, and the rack hook. The gathering pallet is a cam with a small off-center pin, and it's mounted on the pallet wheel. As mentioned earlier, each rotation of the gathering pallet corresponds to 1 hammer strike. When engaged with the rack, the gathering pin pushes the rack forward by 1 tooth with each turn, effectively using the rack as a mechanical counter. The rack is weighted toward one side, giving it a natural tendency to fall in that direction when released. During the striking sequence, the rack is held in place by the lower pin on the rack hook. There's also an upper pin on the same rack hook that interacts with the gathering pallet. As the gathering pallet rotates, its pin advances the rack tooth by tooth. After each advancement, the outer pin of the rack hook falls into the next tooth, holding the rack in position until the gathering pin comes around again. This continues until the rack hook falls off the last tooth of the rack, meaning the desired count has been reached. Once that happens, the upper pin on the rack hook comes into full contact with the cam surface of the gathering pallet. It now acts as a stop, blocking further rotation. This creates a system where the gathering pallet can only rotate a specific number of times, determined by how many teeth were available on the rack at the beginning of the strike cycle. For example, if the outer pin of the rack hook starts 4 teeth away from the left end of the rack, the gathering pallet will complete 4 rotations, resulting in 4 strikes, before being stopped by the upper pin. But how does the rack get positioned correctly for each hour? This is where the snail comes in. Named for its spiral-like shape, the snail is mounted on the hour wheel and rotates once every 12 hours, just like the hour hand. It has 12 distinct steps, 1 for each hour. The rack tail, which is an extension on the rack, rests against the edge of the snail. When the rack is released, it falls onto the snail. The depth to which it falls depends on which step of the snail it lands on. For instance, when the rack tail rests on the widest part of the snail, representing 1 o'clock, only 1 tooth of the rack is positioned under the rack hook, allowing just 1 strike. As the snail rotates hour by hour, the rack tail falls deeper, placing more rack teeth under the hook and increasing the number of strikes. The deepest step corresponds to 12 o'clock, positioning the hook 12 teeth away from the left, enabling 12 strikes. Once the gathering pallet completes its designated number of turns and the upper pin blocks it, the strike sequence ends. The lower pin on the rack hook then prevents the rack from falling back onto the snail until the next hour arrives. The release of the rack for the next hour is also controlled by the long lever. On the chime locking disc, there's a raised bump that lifts the strike flirt at the right moment. This, in turn, lifts the rack hook and allows the rack to fall back onto the snail, setting up for the next strike sequence. As the rack is released, the gathering pallet is briefly set into motion until the warning wheel is halted by the lever. This moment is known as the warning phase. It prepares the strike train for action and signals that the hourly chime is about to occur. Once the lever drops into its groove, the warning wheel is freed and the strike train begins operating. The gathering pallet resumes rotation, and the clock strikes the number of times corresponding to the rack's position on the snail. One subtle but important design detail is that the rack tail is not rigid like the rack itself. It is made of a flexible metal strip. Likewise, the snail has a sloped edge on this part. This design decouples the strike train from the motion work of the clock. For example, if the strike train runs out of power and stops with the rack stuck on the lowest point of the snail, a rigid rack tail would block the snail from rotating further. This could interfere with the movement of the hour hand or even stop the entire clock. The flexible rack tail prevents that by simply bending and sliding over the snail, allowing the clock to keep ticking until the strike mechanism is reset properly. Today, almost everything is powered by chips and controlled by code, so it is important to learn how modern technologies work. For learning the machines of the past, I got you covered. But for mastering today's tech, I recommend Brilliant, our sponsor for this video. Brilliant is a hands-on learning platform that helps you think critically and solve problems through thousands of interactive lessons in math, science, programming, data analysis, and AI. Their new course on digital circuits gives you a peek into the inner workings of computer chips, and their programming courses teach you how to program them to build complex systems. What makes Brilliant different is its focus on active learning. Instead of just reading, you'll engage directly with problems and concepts, building real intuition as you go. The mobile-friendly, bite-sized lessons make it easy to keep learning anytime, anywhere. And before you realize it, you'll be developing a powerful learning habit. To learn for free on Brilliant, go to brilliant.org/Quasar-Ed, scan the QR code on screen, or click on the link in the description. Brilliant's also given our viewers 20% off an annual premium subscription, which gives you unlimited daily access to everything on Brilliant. Now let's take a closer look at the chiming train. Like the strike train, it begins with its own great wheel, driven by a dedicated weight, and ends at the top with a fly governor, or air brake, to regulate its speed. Starting from the third gear in the train, let's call it the chiming wheel, we see two important components mounted on its arbor. On the front side, it carries the chime locking disc, and on the back, it drives the chiming drum through a 2-to-1 gear ratio. This means that for every full rotation of the chiming gear, the drum rotates twice. The chiming drum contains a fixed arrangement of pins or teeth that lift and drop a set of hammers, each of which strikes a tuned metal rod. These rods are of different lengths to produce 4 distinct musical notes used in the Westminster chime. So each hammer corresponds to a specific note. The Westminster chime is made up of a sequence of 40 notes, distributed across the 4 quarters of the hour. 4 notes at the first quarter, 8 notes at the half hour, 12 notes at the third quarter, and the full 16-note melody at the hour. If you examine the note pattern, it repeats after 20 notes. And those 20-note sequences are mechanically encoded into the chiming drum through the arrangement of its teeth in relation to the hammer positions. With a 2-to-1 gear ratio, the drum completes 2 full rotations for every single turn of the chime wheel, allowing the entire sequence to be played over the course of 1 hour. Without a control mechanism, the chiming train would spin freely as long as the weight allows, continuously repeating the melody. This is prevented by the chime locking disc, which regulates when the chiming train is allowed to run. On the arbor of the long lever, there is a hook that holds back a pin attached to the chiming gear when the long lever pin is in the groove. When the long lever is lifted above the groove, the pin clears the hook, releasing the chiming train to run. The locking disc has 4 raised sections separated by grooves. The 4 segments of the chime locking disc correspond to the 4 quarters. The first segment allows 4 notes, the second allows 8, the third allows 12, and the final full rotation allows 16. This makes a total of 40 notes per full revolution of the chime wheel, while the chiming drum only contains a 20-note pattern, hence the need for the 2-to-1 gear ratio. To release the chiming train at the correct quarter hour, a 4-pointed star wheel is mounted on the minute's arbor. Since the minute wheel rotates once per hour, each point of the star divides the hour into 4 equal parts. As it turns, each point of the star lifts a release lever, which pushes against a short spring-loaded lever called the chime flirt. When the long lever is in the groove, the chiming train is held in place by the hook. When the star wheel is rotating and if one side engages with the release lever lifts the short lever, which in turn lifts the long lever. When the hook is raised just enough to let the pin escape, and the train begins moving, but only briefly. The short lever engages with the stop pin on the next gear and temporarily halts the chiming train. This is known as the warning phase. You can often hear this as a subtle clicking sound just before the chimes start. Once the star wheel reaches its peak and the short lever drops back down, it releases the stop pin. Now the chiming train runs freely and plays the correct melody for that quarter. After completing its run, the pin on the long lever drops into the next groove on the locking disc, and the hook catches the stop pin. The chiming train waits for the next release by the star wheel. There's an elegant connection here between the chiming and the hour strike. When the pin on the long lever reaches this section of the disc, the final quarter-hour chime is played. This happens when the minute hand is pointing exactly at 12 o'clock. Just before the chiming ends, A small raised bump on the disc lifts the long lever slightly higher. This action raises the rack hook and prepares the rack for the hourly strike. However, the strike train is still held in place by the long lever. When the lever finally drops into the groove, the chiming ends and the strike train is released. This ensures the hour strike only begins after the final quarter chime, keeping the chiming and striking perfectly in sync. However, there's a challenge when manually setting the time. To allow the manual adjustment of time, the minute arbor isn't rigidly fixed to the center wheel, it's only connected via friction. Since the motion of the time train is limited by the escapement, the center wheel can't be rotated. So the minute arbor can only be rotated by overcoming the friction. To avoid accidentally triggering the chime while adjusting the time, the hands should be turned counterclockwise. This is because the release lever has a shorter arm on the left side, so when the star wheel rotates counterclockwise, it doesn't lift the short lever high enough to reach and activate the long lever. However, rotating the star wheel backward still changes its position. As a result, the time shown on the dial may no longer match the positions of the chiming and striking mechanisms, causing them to fall out of sync. For instance, if you move the minutes hand to 30 minutes past the hour, but the chime train is still at the first quarter position, after 15 minutes, the clock will only play the first quarter chime. 4 notes, instead of the correct third quarter sequence. Furthermore, since the hour strike is triggered by the end of the final quarter sequence, it too would be delayed and out of sync with the hour hand. To solve this, many clocks include an auto-correction mechanism. Behind the chime locking disc is a second locking cam, along with a secondary hook and cam lever. This secondary hook is not fixed to the long lever arbor, but is operated by the cam profile. When the lever rides along the outer circumference of the cam, the secondary hook is inactive. But when it falls into a cutout, it engages and holds the chiming train along with the primary hook. This secondary hook can be lifted by the first one via a connecting pin, but only if the long lever is lifted a little higher than usual. This is where the longer arm of the star wheel comes in. It lifts the long lever higher during the last quarter-hour release. At that moment, with the minutes hand pointing exactly at 12, the second hook is lifted, and the chiming train starts running briefly until it is stopped by the short lever. When the short lever drops, the chime train is free to play the final 16-note sequence. The hour strike then follows immediately afterward, and everything is brought back into sync. Let's say you manually set the minutes hand to 20 minutes past, but the chime locking disc is still at the first quarter. In that case, the clock would chime the first quarter at 30 minutes, the second quarter at 45, and third quarter at 60. But after the third quarter, when the chime locking disc reaches the fourth quarter position, the secondary hook steps in and blocks further chiming. The chiming train is now held until the minute hand reaches the top of the hour. At that point, the final quarter chime and hour strike are released, and the system is corrected. No manual adjustment needed. It's remarkable how this compact and subtle mechanism ensures the chimes and time remain aligned, even after manual setting. Without it, realignment would require disassembling or manually advancing the gear trains, something only a skilled clockmaker could do. To silence the chime or strike at night, there are levers on each side of the mechanism. When pulled down, these levers lift the hammers, preventing them from engaging with the chiming drum or ratchet wheel. They can be accessed from the front of the clock and are typically labeled silent chime or silent strike. Let's calculate how much weight drop is needed for the chiming train to run for 8 days. We'll begin with the chiming wheel, which completes 1 rotation per hour. Over 8 days, that's 192 rotations. This motion is reduced by the second gear with a 16:64 ratio, and further reduced by the great wheel with a 12:60 ratio. As a result, the great wheel only needs to rotate about 9.6 times over 8 days. Given the effective diameter of the sprocket wheel is 3.5 centimeters, the chiming train requires approximately 1.05 meters of weight drop. Now, let's calculate the required drop distance for the strike train. In a 12-hour cycle, the hammer strikes a total of 78 times. Over 8 days, 192 hours, that amounts to 1,248 strikes. Since the ratchet gear has 10 teeth, it must rotate 124.8 times to deliver all the strikes. This motion is reduced by the second gear with a 14:46 ratio and further reduced by the great wheel with a 15:60 ratio. So, the great wheel only needs to rotate about 9.495 times. Using the same sprocket diameter of 3.5 centimeters, the strike train requires approximately 1.0445 meters of weight drop to operate for 8 days. So all three mechanisms are designed to run out of power at the same time. Think you've learned everything about the grandfather clock? Think again, because we still need to talk about its giant pendulum. Just because it's shiny and golden doesn't mean it's purely decorative. Those rods have a very specific function. Pendulum rods made of metal, like steel or brass, expand when temperatures rise and contract when they fall. Even small changes in length can affect the pendulum's swing period, causing the clock to run fast or slow. To solve this, clockmakers use a clever design involving two different metals, typically steel and brass, or sometimes zinc. Brass expands about twice as much as steel for the same temperature change. Here's how it works. The rods are arranged so that when the steel rod expands, say by 1 centimeter, it would normally cause the pendulum bob to lower. But at the same time, the brass rods expand upward by 2 centimeters, perfectly canceling out the change in length. As a result, the effective length of the pendulum stays constant, and the clock remains accurate. This ingenious design is called a gridiron pendulum, or a temperature-compensating pendulum. The decorative structure covering the rods is called the lyre, named after the ancient stringed instrument it resembles. Now, let's close everything up and wrap up this long, but hopefully fascinating, explainer. The grandfather clock is more than just a tool for keeping time. It's a statement of craftsmanship, elegance, and legacy. Each clock was meticulously handcrafted, making every piece unique, often reflecting the artistry and pride of its maker. For centuries, these tall, chiming clocks stood in the homes of the wealthy, not only as reliable timekeepers but also as symbols of power, refinement, and status. Today, they are cherished as collectible antiques, timeless works of functional art that continue to capture the imagination and admiration of generations. If you enjoyed this journey through time and craftsmanship, consider subscribing to the channel for more stories behind the machines that shaped our world. Thank you for watching till the end, and I'll see you in the next video.